pretty convinced that the disciple Thomas was from the state of Missouri, the show me state. Now, no one really knows exactly how our state got its unique and unusual motto. There are several different origin stories or legends about how this may have come to be. But one of the most popular theories is that the show me state was coined by a U.S. congressman from Missouri named Willard Duncan Van Diver. He served in the House of Representatives from 1897 to 1903. In 1899, he was sent to Philadelphia to give a speech, and as a part of his speech, he said these words: "I come from a state that raises corn and cotton and cockleburs. Frothy eloquence neither convinces nor satisfies me. I am from Missouri. You have got to show me." So in today's passage from John 20, we can almost hear Thomas saying something similar. Your fancy words about Jesus risen from the dead is not going to convince me. You have got to show me. Now, often we give Thomas a hard time because of this. In the church, we've even given him an unfortunate nickname, Doubting Thomas. Now, that's hardly fair. I mean, we don't go around telling Peter or saying Peter was denying Peter. All of the disciples had reason to be given bad nicknames, but poor Thomas is stuck with this nickname, Doubting Thomas. So today, I want to shift that narrative a little bit. I want to give Thomas a new nickname. In today's world, we might say we need to rebrand him. We need to give his brand an update. Because at the end of this story, he is no longer doubting Thomas. Rather, he is believing Thomas. After all, even though he was the last disciple to see the risen Christ in the flesh, he was the first to proclaim his allegiance to Jesus, saying, "My Lord and my God." When Jesus appeared to the other disciples, we don't know what they said. It says that they rejoiced. Perhaps they were stunned, speechless. Now, Thomas, he appears another time in John's gospel, in John chapter 11. And this was a time when Jesus was talking to his disciples and saying that he was going to go down to Bethany to visit Mary and Martha. Lazarus was dying near the point of death, and so he was going to go see him. We learned about that story a few weeks ago. But in the midst of this, the disciples are saying, you can't go to Bethany. Bethany is too close to Jerusalem, and the Jewish religious authorities, they want to hurt you. They want to kill you. And of course, that is in fact what they ended up doing. But it was Thomas, of all the disciples, who boldly proclaimed, "Let us go down with Jesus too, so that we may die with him." Thomas, who we've cast as Doubting Thomas, hardly seems like a man controlled by his doubts and fears in this statement. This is a man who had cast his lot with Jesus, for better or for worse, was willing to die alongside him. And also, Thomas wasn't alone in his doubts. We see in John chapter 20 that all of the disciples doubted that Jesus had been raised from the dead. Peter and John, they went to see the empty tomb, and when they saw that Jesus' body wasn't there, I don't know, I guess they just kind of shrugged their shoulders and went on home. And then when Mary Magdalene saw the empty tomb, she sat down and cried, thinking that someone had moved Jesus' body. It wasn't until she saw Jesus and he called her by name that her doubts were vanished. And likewise, then Mary went to tell all the disciples, "I've seen Jesus, I've seen him in the flesh, he has been raised again." And they doubted her words, just like Thomas doubted the disciples when they tried to tell him that they had seen Jesus. So all of the disciples at one point or another doubted that Jesus was alive. And in fact, when this story begins, we find them locked away and hiding for fear of the Jewish religious authorities. So Thomas is not the only one at fault here for doubting. But in fact, we often give doubt a bad reputation in our world. We think that it's somehow wrong to doubt, or that we're not very good Christians if we have doubts or questions. There's a lot of shame and stigma around doubt, particularly in the church or in certain religious communities. Congregations often don't do well when they are challenged or they have dissenters within their midst. When I was a youth pastor, one of the main concerns of my teenagers revolved around doubt. They would ask things like, is it okay for me to doubt? Is it wrong for me to have doubts about God or the Bible or my faith? Does God think less of me when I doubt God? Our students, for a time, they kept raising these questions so often that as a youth leadership team, we decided to do a series on faith and doubt and questions. And as we prepared for this series, we interviewed several of our students to find out what exactly they were doubting or what their concerns revolved around. We talked to one sophomore girl, and she shared this. I feel like it's easy to have doubts about God when things in your life aren't going too smoothly. You wonder why God would put you through something like that. There have definitely been times in my life where I've doubted if God is even real because of what I've been going through. I think we can all relate to her words, but I thought she was so brave to have the courage to name our doubts aloud when so many of us fear that we will get chastised or shamed because of our doubts. We are afraid that we might be labeled doubting Thomas as well. So we're not comfortable with our doubts a lot of times. Many of us may even think that doubt is the opposite of faith. But in fact, doubt and faith are two sides of the exact same coin. Doubt and faith can coexist. In fact, they even complement each other. The great 20th century theologian Paul Tillich, he once said that doubt isn't the opposite of faith, it is an element of faith. He would go on to say that our doubts are not overcome by repressing them or stifling them, hoping they just go away, but our doubts are overcome through courage. Courage does not deny that we have doubts. Rather, courage emboldens us to ask the tough and hard questions. Doubt can be a wonderful tool that propels us deeper in our faith and deeper in our relationship with God. I mean, think of it this way. People who automatically believe everything, they don't question everything, we don't call them faithful. We call them naive. We call them gullible. Thomas had great courage in working through his doubts. He had the courage to admit his disbelief, to demand proof that Jesus had been raised from the dead. He had the courage to ask the tough questions that all the other disciples probably wanted to know the answers to, but were just too embarrassed or scared to ask. And then here's what I love about this story. Jesus met Thomas exactly where he was at. Jesus met Thomas in his place of doubt, in his demand for answers. Jesus does not shame Thomas. Jesus did not admonish him, but rather Jesus gently offers Thomas the proof he requires. Here, Thomas, see my hands. See my scars. Put your fingers on them. Take all the proof you need. Luther Seminary professor Dr. Joy Moore puts it really nicely. She says that the wonder of this moment is Jesus' willingness to meet Thomas exactly where Thomas names he needs meeting. Thomas names what Jesus knew all of his disciples needed. The doors are shut and Jesus appears, nail scars and all. His offering of peace is followed by a demonstration of forgiveness. No condemnation for Thomas's request, a simple invitation. The disciples rejoiced, but Thomas's response is pure praise, my Lord and my God. Jesus' appearance to Thomas, it was a kindness. It was an act of mercy. Jesus showed up for Thomas, even in his doubt. And thus, Thomas the doubter became Thomas the believer. Likewise, Jesus is not afraid of our doubts. Jesus can handle our tough questions. And Jesus longs to meet us exactly in that place where we need him, because he responds with love and compassion and kindness and mercy, never with shame or chastisement. And here's what's even more beautiful about this story. There's this really weird verse in this passage that we read today that says, if you retain the sins of if anyone sins, retain the sins against them. Of whomever you forgive the sins, they are forgiven them, but whoever you retain the sins, they are retained against them. What does that mean? So I started digging a little bit into this strange little passage today, and in the original Greek, that second part of the verse, it's verse 23, doesn't actually say anything about sins. The Greek word for sin is nowhere in that second statement. If you retain the sins of any, they are retained. That word sin isn't there in the original Greek. So we have Sandra Snyders is a biblical scholar, and she said that this verse would better be translated like this. Of whomever you forgive the sins, they are forgiven them. Whomever you hold fast, they are held fast. So we are to hold the person, not their sins, against them. We are to hold people in their doubts. So what's beautiful is that this community of disciples, they gathered around Thomas even in his place of doubts, and they held him fast. They held him tight. And that's what we are called to do. We see the same pattern of embracing others in their doubts, even in Matthew's gospel. The very last chapter of Matthew's gospel, Matthew 28, Jesus is appearing to his disciples one final time, giving them some final instructions. We know it as the Great Commission. And we read this really interesting verse that says, 28:16, "Now the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain where Jesus told them to go. When they had saw him, they worshiped him, but some of them doubted." The original 11 disciples still had doubts about Jesus, even though they had seen him in the flesh, they had seen the nail scars, but some of them still doubted. But this fellowship of disciples, they didn't exclude the doubters. They didn't say, "You can't be here worshiping with us if you have doubts." Instead, they retained them. They held them fast. They embraced them in their midst. The community of disciples was with Thomas, holding him fast, embracing him until that moment when he could encounter Christ for himself. They were still invited to worship alongside even the doubters. Now, when people around us find themselves in a place of doubt, I think that's the best thing we can do for them. Embrace them, hold them fast, keep them tight, in embracing them in spite of their doubts. We are not to hold their doubts against them. We're not to hold their sins against them. We are to hold them. We are to embrace them. So if you are here and you have any doubts about Jesus today, if you are questioning whether or not God is even real, know today that you are held fast in this community's arms. You are embraced by this community of believers. We are here holding your faith for you, even if you can't hold it for yourself. And then finally, there's this beautiful little passage the beautiful little verse in this passage where Jesus has a message that's directly related to us. He says, "Blessed are those who have not seen me and yet still believe." This is the message for us, because as far as I know, none of you have seen Jesus in the flesh, but you still got up and came to church this morning. If even Jesus' own disciples doubted, how much more so are we in our doubts who have not seen Jesus in the flesh? But all of us at some point or another have pushed through those doubts, have used those doubts to propel us into a deeper relationship with Jesus and got us to a place where we could also believe. That's what Thomas did too. So let's turn back to Thomas a final time. Doubting Thomas became believing Thomas, and except for a brief mention in the book of Acts where he is listed alongside the other 12 or the other 11 disciples, we don't hear anything else about Thomas. We don't hear what he went on to do. We don't hear how he lived out his proclamation, "My Lord and my God." We hear a lot about Peter and James and John in the book of Acts and afterwards, but nothing more is said of Thomas in the Bible. However, according to Christian tradition, Thomas went on to become a great missionary for Jesus. According to, like I said, tradition, in the year 52, he traveled to the southwestern tip of India, where he lived and spread the good news of Jesus for the next 20 years until his death. He did exactly what Jesus had commissioned him to do, to go and baptize new believers, teaching them everything Jesus had commanded them. Even today, if you are to go to that part of India, many churches bear St. Thomas's name. And then in the year 72, he was killed. He was martyred for his faith. He was killed by a spear, and he was buried in a tomb in India. You can even go see his tomb today in Mylapore, India. Thomas, this disciple who we know as the doubting disciple, became the believing disciple, and he took the message of the resurrected Jesus 3,000 miles away from Jerusalem. His doubts propelled him to seek after Jesus, and his belief enabled him to give over his life for Jesus, just as he had sworn to do all those years earlier. So today, if you find yourself in the place of Thomas, if you find that you are doubting, that you have questions, I invite you to allow those questions to draw you closer to Jesus. Ask from Jesus what it is that you need. Have the courage to ask those tough questions, to demand answers from God, because God will meet us in our place of doubt. And secondly, I invite you to allow this community of believers to embrace you, to hold you fast, to lift you up even in your doubting. I think of Thomas and how his doubts took him all the way to India, and I wonder where our doubts may end up taking us. Let's pray. Gracious and loving God, we thank you for this message that you do not leave us in our doubts. You do not abandon us when we are afraid, but you come with your reassurance and your message of peace be with us. You know the hearts of those of us listening today, that some of us may have our own questions. Some of us may have our own fears. We may wonder where you are in the midst of our lives. So we invite you to show up. We invite you to be present in our lives. We invite you to come into our midst, into our hearts, and say, I'm here. I am with you. We thank you for all that you've done through this community of faith, this community that will hold others even in their place of doubt. We ask that we would continue to be that community, embracing others each and every day. We ask this in your Son's name. Amen.